The double child murderer and rapist Colin Pitchfork has been granted parole and will be released from prison. Mr. Pitchfork was jailed for life for raping and strangling two 15-year-old girls, Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth, in Leicestershire in 1983 and 1986. He was released on parole in 2021, but was soon recalled back to prison after he was understood to have approached young women on multiple occasions while on walks. In its decision to release him again, the parole board determined, quote, that it was no longer necessary for the protection of the public for Pitchfork to remain confined, and thereby directed his release. We'll speak to a criminal behavioural analyst, Laura Richards, in just a moment. First, Liam Kotrie is a solicitor and director of Mary Munson Solicitors, a criminal defence firm. Liam, good evening.
Good evening.
Can you help the public get their head around why the parole board would release a man like this?
Well, there are many considerations that come into play when making such a difficult decision. We heard from Mr. Baker, who was one of the investigating officers in the case, and he talked of the family and how difficult this time must be for them, and I echo those thoughts. So we need to be very sensitive when we talk about them, and that is the way that the parole board deals with these cases. This is a man who, yes, received a life sentence, but a minimum term of 30 years, at which point he is eligible for parole. In this case, he was granted parole in 2021, but recalled. And
proved he couldn't be trusted.
Well, in fact, that decision was based on faulty information, and Dominic Raab, who was the Justice Secretary at the time, had to admit that that was the case. In fact, while he was thought to have spoken to a number of different women, it was in fact the case that he gave a woman directions in the probation car park. He was reprimanded for that, and it seems that there was a breakdown in communication and he was recalled for something else entirely. And it seems that that's actually what happened. Now, whether or not he should have been released at the time, whether or not he should be recalled, that's beyond my remit here, because I didn't deal directly with the case. And that's something that's so important in cases like this. The parole board has a wealth of information from the prison, probably from psychiatrists. They have to think about many things. This is a man who pleaded guilty in the first place, although he did avoid detection for some time. He confessed in interview, confessed to a number of different things in an interview, including exposing himself to a number of women over a number of different occasions. When the parole board are considering these things, they would take into account that he pleaded guilty, but they'd also take into account his behaviour in prison, his plan when he'd be released, whether or not they feel he's a danger to the public. And in fact, the parole board have issued a statement and they've talked about what is most important in these situations, and they have to focus on risk, not punishment. And that's what they've said. So based on all of these things, and plus previous offences, he does have a previous conviction for indecent exposure, as it was known back then, what the judge said when sentenced, and also the statements from families, they are listened to, they are considered. All of these things are taken into consideration when it's decided whether or not someone is a risk if they are let out. This is not about punishment. This is not about our personal feelings on the case, although it must be so difficult for everyone involved not to have personal feelings on such a sensitive issue. But here it's about the facts, and the facts are so important that we must rely on those so everyone has certainty when these decisions are made. When anyone is involved in criminal justice, we all need to know that we have certainty, because if we don't know where we stand, and the law must be certain for all.
You say this is based on the facts, and look, I know what you mean, but actually the decision of the parole board is based on a subjective opinion, isn't it? That they believe Pitchfork will not rape or strangle or commit another heinous crime like he did to two 15-year-old girls. And they can't be sure. It's impossible to be sure.
Well, let's go back to the sentence. And really, if I may, the question could be, do they need to believe him? It's up to them to decide on all of these factors, as well as his own submissions, perhaps from his own lawyer, whether or not he is a risk. But that doesn't mean they just let him out and he carries on. Again, this is a life sentence. He will be on license for the rest of his life. He will be supervised and monitored very closely for the rest of his life. He will not live a normal life. He will not have the freedoms the rest of us have. Where he lives, where he travels, with whom he has relationships, where he works, all of these things will be incredibly closely watched. I understand there are tens of different prohibitions on his license now, license conditions, I should say. So there is little chance of him committing a further offence, even if he wanted to.
How is there little chance?
Well, because of the conditions that are placed on him. Now, I don't work for the parole board. I don't work for the probation service.
Absolutely, and you're not accountable for the decision. I get that. I'm trying to understand how there will be little chance of him committing an offence, because nobody released into society is monitored 24 hours a day. It is impossible
and that's it, and that may be the concern. But what would the answer be? Everyone who commits a crime is locked up for the rest of their lives in case they commit another one? Or everyone who's convicted of certain crimes are locked up forever? Some people feel that is the answer. But the current answer is, as it stands, it is the law. So after 30 years, he has to be considered for parole. It took him 3 years. He passed after 3 years, but of course he was recalled and had to do another 3 years. He spent 36 years in prison. I heard one of the people from the towns where one of the women died, I think it was Narborough, and the way they spoke eloquently about the way that the town feels, and it must be incredibly difficult at times like this. But they talked about whether or not he should ever leave, and they gave a lot of opinions on these things. But they were talking about the man 36 years ago, not the man today. I'm not saying he's a good person. I don't know him. I've not assessed him. I've not read the report. That's not been made public. But what I can say is that one would expect someone to change somewhat in 36 years. Some may disagree with me. And if they do, that's fine.
Why would that report, Liam, not be made public? Why is it not in the public interest for us to see that report?
I assume it's for good reason. I'm afraid I do not know the answer. It would be very interesting to read it. Perhaps the public would have more understanding if that kind of information was made available.
Exactly.
I mean, the process that the parole board goes through to decide whether or not to release someone like Pitchfork, perhaps people would be able to show more understanding for the process if that were the case. But a lot of the information may well be confidential, the psychiatric reports, for example.
Laura Richards, stay there for me, Liam, if you can. Laura Richards is a criminal behavioural analyst, former head of the sexual offences unit, former head of the homicide prevention unit at New Scotland Yard. Good evening, Laura.
Hi there.
You've clearly got a lot of experience. Just to say that I've got to meet a lot of prisoners who have done very, very bad things. And the notion that you lock them up, you throw away the key, is facile, it's vacuous, and it doesn't work. I understand that. But how, Laura, does a probation board decide to trust someone that is so manipulative and has done something, has the capacity to hurt children in this way? Can people really change beyond that?
Yes, and I've worked many of these cases, and I just want to say my heart goes out to Linda Mann's family and Dawn Ashworth, and they were children. They weren't women. I just want to make it clear. He is a child killer, a predatory stalker, a serial rapist, and a serial killer. So the most dangerous type of perpetrator. And so we can't just talk about the general prison population. And when we talk about Colin Pitchfork, and one of my real concerns is about this risk assessment. And having challenged many of the risk assessments and being an expert on risk assessment myself, what I will say is that I hope he has been risk assessed for psychopathy, because psychopathy is not treatable. It's not curable. A psychopath has no empathy, no remorse. They want to have power and control over. They will do anything and say anything. They will mimic emotions, and they will do anything and say anything to get out of prison. And age does not decrease the risk that they pose. In prison, we have to understand it's an artificial environment. There aren't girls and women there, which is his target group. Therefore, any risk assessment is flawed in essence because he's in an artificial situation. So the quality of the staff doing those risk assessments and in probation is absolutely critical. And there have been some spectacular failures in the past where women have been killed by offenders who shouldn't have been released. And therefore, you have to weigh up all the risks. There's no certainty or absolutes when it comes to risk. But what I do know about psychopaths is they don't stop. They will not stop offending.
Well, what's the definition of a psychopath?
There are 20 traits of a psychopath, and there's a psychopathy checklist. For short, it's called the PCLR. And some of the key traits of psychopaths is that they have no empathy. That's the thing that stands them out. They have no remorse. They're pathological liars. They don't take responsibility for what they've done. They're charming and they're chameleon-esque. So we have to really understand, the risk assessment. Who's been doing the risk assessment, and have they assessed him for psychopathy?
Yeah, but you know that we've got to go with the facts. The facts is that he has been convicted of killing 2 children and raping them, 2 15-year-old girls. You suspect that he has committed other crimes, but we don't know. So you don't know if he meets the criteria to be a psychopath.
No,
Within
what
all
I'm
of that
raising the question about is, has he even been assessed for it? That's the point. In a proper risk assessment that is thorough, if he is a psychopath, if he scores the points that push him over into psychopathy, he would not be safe to be released.
Can I be clear, though? If I go back to what we definitely know, that he raped and strangled 2 15-year-old children, with what we know, and that's what we know, are you saying that should be a life sentence without any chance of parole? If someone has the capacity to do that to 2 children?
Yes, I am saying that if it happened present day, he would most likely get a whole life tariff, that he would be one of the few that should not be released. And I go back to what Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales said at the time of his sentencing. He said that from his point of view of the safety of the public, I doubt he should ever be released. When
you're saying, you've seen flawed reports, surely there would not be a flawed assessment. Surely there would be an assessment for psychopathy for such a risky decision without it. A high-profile decision. Surely they will be dotting every I, crossing every T before they release this guy.
You would hope so, but I can tell you through my professional experience, that's not always the case. Often,
that's astonishing.
It is. And that's why these abject failures are so concerning, because it doesn't mean that people do have the privilege or knowledge of all of that information. Sometimes assessments are made without even looking at the index offence, without looking at the crime scene photos, without listening to a surviving victim or having impact statements. There's just been a recent case where the survivor of a very dangerous offender who was almost killed, she was almost left out of the parole board process. It does happen. And there have been failures like Janet Scott, who was murdered because Simon Mellor was released. He'd already murdered another woman, Pearl Black, and he wasn't recalled to prison and he went on to kill. Zara Alina, Jordan McSweeney was released and he immediately stalked and murdered Zara. There have been these spectacular failures, and given the work that I do get involved in these cases, and that's why it's not just about people being outraged about what he did. It's also looking at the facts of what we know about the case, as you quite rightly said, and assessing, having the experts assess using all our up-to-date knowledge. And the psychopathy checklist is a predatory stalker as well. There are assessments for stalkers. My question is, has all of that happened?
So one of the basic questions here is, as a society, are we prepared to trust, release, and embrace into our society again people who do murder, people who do rape children, people who do strangle children? And our legislators have decided that yes, we should. But the basic question is, can they be trusted if they've got the capacity to do that?
Well, my response to that is every case must be assessed on its own merit and the facts of the case. Based on everything that I do know about Colin Pitchfork, I would have grave reservations about his release. So every case on its own merit, but I do know about psychopaths, and I do know about when they target women and girls and children. They're vulnerable, and these are the individuals who want power over them and will not stop their offending behaviour. And no probation officer can monitor or supervise somebody out in the public domain 24/7. It's just not realistic. And if you have to have buffer zones and all these other protective orders around the perpetrator, then I would argue if you have to do all of those things, they're not safe to be released. And why take the gamble? Why put women and children at risk?
Liam?
You can tell a lot by the way a society treats its prisoners. Giving people another chance, no matter what crime they've committed, perhaps is something that should always be considered. So many people find themselves defined by the worst thing that they have ever done. And perhaps that's the way it should be. But I feel that people need to be listened to, assessed properly. We've heard a lot about psychopathy in this conversation. Good evening, Laura. And I understand why those thoughts are put forward here. But I've done quite a bit of research on this case, and I've spoken about it on the radio before. And I've not heard of any such diagnosis or even suspicion, and we've talked about whether or not those tests took place when considering whether or not to grant parole, one would think they were, or certainly in-depth psychiatric assessments, which may trigger further assessments should some of those traits come to light. And one can only think that psychiatrists working with the parole board on cases like these would be looking out for those traits, regardless of whether or not they were testing directly for them. But again, while this is perhaps the crime or the crimes of a psychopath, there has been no such diagnosis as far as I'm aware. If this sentence should have been full life, and I'm not saying it should, I'm not saying it shouldn't, but if the feeling is that it should have been, we have to ask ourselves why the judge, who is most likely, and I'm not 100% on this, but most likely a high court judge, incredibly senior judge dealing with this case, didn't give a full life sentence. Why the prosecution didn't appeal that sentence if they felt it should have been a full life sentence. Now, it is often the case that people are given minimum terms but are never released and end up spending their whole lives in prison. But it is important that these things are in place so that people can be assessed throughout that time. And I mean throughout that time, for the first 30 years. And remember, all the reasons I gave for why someone would be granted parole, their behaviour in prison. That's 36 years or 33 taking the time. But
let me pick up the sexual element around this with Laura, because Laura, what you said earlier was, look, there are no women around him in prison, therefore it's an artificial environment to assess him. When you had the element of rape in this heinous crime, he raped these two 15-year-old girls. When there is that sexual motive around a murder, is someone who has that sexual motive to kill someone, do they often repeat the crime when they're released?
In my experience, yes, they do. And I think that is important to understand, because some of the research, when we talk about lifers, saying that lifers are less likely to commit further serious offences under the supervision of probation, that doesn't include psychopaths or sex offenders. So you're right, Stephen, to point out the sexual element, the sexually motivated aspects of his crimes. And that's why it's so important to assess people properly. And when we think about even the tariffs that are handed down, I've worked on cases where offenders haven't received the most serious sentence across the decade. So our knowledge is much greater now. We have to think about the sexual element.
Yeah, I'm asking a slightly different question in that it is perverse and bizarre to all of us listening to this to even contemplate how another human being can rape a child for some type of sexual motivation. What I'm asking is, can prison and rehabilitation in prison take away that sexual desire to do that to a child?
When talking about sex offenders specifically, there's not evidence to support that. So you may be aware that there was the sex offenders treatment program, which was introduced in 1991 to try and change the behaviour of sex offenders. But a damning report came out about the impact of it, that it actually made those men worse and they were more likely to reoffend. So it was scrapped in 2017. They are a very tricky, manipulative, devious group of perpetrators. And that's why there must be a very careful assessment by very experienced professionals.
Are you saying tonight, in a nutshell, that you believe Pitchfork will attempt to murder again when he's released?
I'm saying that there's every likelihood that he will reoffend.
Liam, I'll let you go, and thank you so much, Liam, for your analysis tonight.